Hi Bearcats! Welcome to the next episode of the Bonita Interview Series. I'm Nora, and this week I had the pleasure of interviewing Mr. Jahoviak, who teaches AP Psychology and AP Human Geography for core. In this episode, we dive into his passion for eSports and how his love for video games led him to coach the eSports team at Bonita. Let's get started. Hi, I'm here with Mr. Jahoviak, and I'm going to interview him about eSports. Hi, Mr. G. Thanks for being here.
Of course, always.
So, talking about video games, can you recall the first time you played a video game?
I can guarantee that the first video game. Actually, no. The more I think about this, I had an answer, and now I have a different one. So the first console I had in my possession would have been a Super Nintendo. But if I'm thinking of the first game I've ever played, I don't think I truly remember this. I just have the vague recollection would be playing Duck Hunt when I'm like 3 years old with my cousin at his house. Like, that would have been the first game I ever played. But game of my own, like I'm playing it, my parents are letting me, it would be like Super Mario Brothers on Super Nintendo. But yeah, first game would have been that ridiculous little plastic light gun thing on the TV of a duck hunt with a goofy dog who's laughing at you. That would have been the first game.
Wow. And was there like a certain game that was more impactful? Like you mentioned Super Mario Bros. Was that the game of your childhood? Or?
Well, so it depends on where your frame of childhood is. If I'm looking at like young life, like elementary school, then I would say it's probably Mario 64 or like Ocarina of Time, Zelda. Okay. That game, I mean, to this day, that's probably the most influential when it comes to like defining what I enjoy in games. And because then, if I'm at 18, probably looking at like Elder Scrolls, Oblivion.
Oh, okay.
Don't ever ask how many hours we're putting into that one when I was your age. Don't ask.
Wow. So video games have evolved a lot since their creation in the 80s, and now they're competitive esports. Do you remember when you first heard the term esports?
So thinking about this one, it's a fascinating breakdown between knowing about tournaments, because tournaments, I've heard of tournaments going on for forever. I had friends when I was in high school and middle school who would compete in fighting game tournaments, and there would be money on the line. There'd be a whole thing. There was a game it wasn't quite an arcade, because it was more specialized than that, but there was like a fighting arcade not too far from here in Arcadia, and there would be these massive tournaments where like hundreds and hundreds of dollars, if not thousands, were on the line. So that was going on even in high school, but it wasn't until I was in college that I started to hear the more like collegiate concept of esport, where it's actually not just tournaments put on by interesting people, but actually starting to be like, you can get scholarships for esports. Colleges will take you in and that is still there, by the way. To this day, you can still. There's a couple of the Cal States that actually offer it. UC Irvine gives scholarships. They have a professional.
That's the greatest excuse ever. No, Mom, I can't do my homework. This is going to be a scholarship later in life.
100%. That's actually when I became a coach doing esports. My first call was to my mom, being like, guess what I now am a coach of and what paid off? All those hours you told me not to play video games, what do you know? I'm now coaching video games.
Yeah.
So it would have been around college when I started to hear of people actually sort of getting scholarships to play games.
That's pretty cool.
It is.
I mean, you mentioned that you're the coach for the esports team here. Did you create the team?
No. Well, so I was the original coach of the team. But the idea of doing an esports team actually happened right around COVID. I was here on campus. I got a knock one day, and Mr. Ritchie popped by my room, and he was like, "I heard you're our resident geek. And, are you interested in hosting an esports team?" And I was like, "Absolutely." Now, I was horrified. I had no idea what that meant. I've never coached. The closest thing I ever did in any of this was band, which is not at all like a sport like this. Like coaching, what is coaching? I'm like, I'll figure that out. My dad coached. I can ask some questions. But yeah, the idea of it came from Mr. Ritchie.
Wow.
But I've been running it since.
Yeah. So your esports team has won quite a few awards.
We have.
Are there any of those awards or accomplishments that stand out to you more?
100%. I mean, the fun. My favorite is how many of us have made it to finals and have done really well in finals. But our first, I think it was our first year, second year, we actually won for FIFA, state of California. One of our players swept, and I mean dominated in FIFA. And then last year we won California again with Splatoon, and those two are also just standouts of the we beat California. We're the top in the state, and that's out of this world. And then on the tails of that one, 2 years ago, my Super Smash team, we made it to third place in the state. And there have been some changes finally with how the games work, given that we're not in person. And I think if these games had been in person, we would have probably won and had a good chance at winning the state.
Wow.
But given that we're not in person and we are in these different schools, I won't point fingers, but there are some interesting things that can happen to connectivity.
I didn't know they weren't in person. I thought they were like, no, wow.
The only time the games currently in California, and this is for eSports as a whole, there are some. I mean, there's a lot of these local, again, talking about Irvine, a lot of these local schools have like eSports arenas. Like
crazy.
Crazy,
wow.
Massive buildings for these things. But for our level, there are a couple of schools up in like Northern California that are starting to do this, and that is the overarching goal is, I think, for us to create our own smaller league that can then go on for CIF. But currently, the only games that are in person are if you are in the first or second places, and your pool is large enough, then you ship off. But otherwise, it's all online.
That's really interesting. I had no idea. I thought all of them were in person.
It's easier in person, and it's more fun in person. But for ease of like our first games this week, we're going up. For instance, I had a team once. We were playing. We weren't even California. We were on we were a Pacific Coast League, and we literally had a game against people in Alaska. So
wow,
right, and that's not going to work that well if we're in person. But online, whatever.
Yeah. Okay, so logistically, it makes sense.
Correct.
So with tournaments coming up in these next few months, do you ever have to make a lineup?
So lineup is tough because that's like we have a rotating on the team, and that's not quite how it works. So to look at Smash, for example, Smash Brothers, we'll have a varsity team, a JV team, and sort of like a Frosh, sort of everybody team. And for the varsity team, we have only 3 players who play in the middle of the game, and we have 1 sub, if not 2 subs, in case somebody's sick or can't make it for the game.
Okay.
And we picked that at the beginning of the season. So it's not really a lineup per sense of like looking at this opponent team and like, all right, I've got 10 people. Who am I going to have on this one? But we are thinking about lineups. So we get access to, in Smash, as a great example, a lot of the players specialize in different characters.
Okay.
And so there is some fun risk-taking you have of match one. We don't know who they're going to set up for match one, but we have these 3 players who have these different characters, and let's look at their 3. And they have these characters. This is a good matchup, and they're their best player. You might play their best first, so maybe we play our guy who's a good counter to that first. And so there is a little bit of fun thinking about strengths and weaknesses as you go to these things.
And since you guys play more than one video game, how do you select a player to stick to one game?
So this really depends on their skill levels and what they want to focus on. We don't have too many players who are playing more than one game.
Okay.
Simply because on one, there's not as much time to practice. We're putting in 2 practices a week plus games. Yeah. And then anytime.
And then at home.
Right. As I tell them, I warn them, I will only approve of so many hours of practice a week. Yeah, I'm not going to call your folks and be like, yeah, at 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, he's just practicing for school. But that's not that much time to work with the team outside of hours. And so usually the players will pick, out of these 4 games that we have, this is the one I want to focus on.
Okay.
I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have any players this year for League of Legends. And I think the issue there is League of Legends, as far as all these games go, is probably the most salt-inducing. It's a very frustrating game to play.
Okay.
And that's a hard thing to do where it's like, all right, I have now dedicated 8 hours plus games, which can be 3 hours of my life per week, to a very frustrating game. And that's hard. That's one of the reasons I think we don't.
That's understandable. That's understandable.
Totally.
And just to wrap things up, do you think esports tournaments are going to grow at all in the next few years?
That's a great question. to start off with the most positive, yes. I think esports as a concept isn't going to go anywhere. This is only growing. It's bringing in more money, doing all these things. However, there's a caveat. We've seen things like Overwatch. Overwatch 2 had this big push from Blizzard, and they were putting a lot of money behind an esports program. And it fell apart, and it died, and the whole league died. I think same thing with FIFA. FIFA used to be offered here on campus, and we no longer offer it. The big reason is these companies are starting to get a little too greedy. They're pushing for loot boxes. They're pushing for all these things. Overwatch 2 really is viewed as a DLC for Overwatch. It should have just been a $15 little add-on, get some more characters. And that's the risk. I don't think esports is going anywhere. The concept's there. Counter-Strike has been having massive tournaments. League of Legends, even though we don't have it, is still going on. Dota 2. These things are bringing in multi-million-dollar tournaments every year with huge turn-ins. But companies need to not get too big for their britches. I think we're going to see an interesting. Some things will be growing, and I think some things will be shrinking.
Okay.
But I think esports as a whole is in a great spot.
And do you think virtual reality is going to have an effect on esports at all? It's growing.
It is. It is. It might. As a child of '89, VR was the thing that we were promised, and that I have always hoped for. And VR is awesome. If you've never had an opportunity to try good VR, it's amazing.
Awesome.
When it's good, it's great. I don't think Sony has put out a thing recently. Meta has been putting out a thing. It's a weird market. We haven't quite hit where everyone has, most families have a Switch. Most families have a computer. Most families have a gaming console. Do most families have VR? Not even close. And that's the thing. If we can sort of get past this hurdle and make VR as commonplace as any gaming, absolutely. And it's going to be some crazy stuff, and we're going to see skills that we've never even thought of. And I hope we get there because VR is awesome. It's just a matter of getting over that hurdle. So we'll see. I would love it. VR games are fun, but right now we'll have to see. We'll have to see.
That's interesting. Well, thank you, Mr. G, for coming, and thank you guys for watching.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed getting to know Mr. G better and his passion for video games. Stay curious, Bearcats, and join us next week for another interview. See you then.